This is a summative review of Unit 4, Early National Period, Essential Information. While the Constitution and Federalist era was a period of uncertainty, the early national period produced many examples that the federal government would remain secure. First, looking at the court. There were important legal precedents established by Chief Justice John Marshall, who strengthened the role of the U.S. Supreme Court as an equal branch of the national government. There are 3 cases that are associated with John Marshall. First, Marbury v. Madison, which established the principle of judicial review, or the right of the court to form a check on the constitutionality of laws. Second, McCulloch v. Maryland, which was an issue about whether the state of Maryland could tax the national bank. While it doesn't say anything specifically in the Constitution about a state taxing the national bank, there is an implied power of the federal government in our federal system as set up by the Constitution that makes it impossible for a state to assume too much power of taxation over a national institution. So this case established the idea of implied powers of the federal government. And then finally, in Gibbons v. Ogden, there was a broad national view of economic affairs, mainly in trade issues. These are the foundation blocks of the court's authority to mediate disagreements between branches of government, levels of government, and competing business interests. During the early 1800s, the United States also experienced much social, political, and economic development that it would help consolidate its national identity. Our unit focused on the period from the 1800 election with Thomas Jefferson to the election of 1828 with Andrew Jackson. In the election of 1800, won by Thomas Jefferson, it was the first American presidential election in which power was peacefully transferred from one political party to another. The Federalist Party, led by John Adams, lost to organized opposition, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who called for a different type of government, a weaker national government based on agriculture and farming. Jefferson, as president in 1803, purchased the huge Louisiana Territory from France, which doubled the size of the United States overnight. Instead of ending at the Mississippi River, the United States with Louisiana Purchase would extend all the way to the Rocky Mountains. He authorized the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore new territories that lay west of the Mississippi River. Sacagawea was an Indian woman who served as their guide and translator. As Thomas Jefferson ended his second term as President of the United States, war clouds were forming once again with Britain. This would be largely the problem of President James Madison. What were the causes of the War of 1812? First, there was British interference with American shipping and impressment issues. Secondly, westward expansionism fueled the call for a declaration of war. There was great suspicion that Indian uprisings were inspired by British interference. Victory over the British in the War of 1812 produced American claims to the Oregon Country, which we shared in joint occupation for a period with Britain, and also increased the migration into Florida, which we later acquired by treaty from Spain. The War of 1812 produced a great American patriotism for the continent and that we owed no allegiance to a crown. This was considered our second war of independence from Great Britain. In what ways did the political democracy change in the years following the War of 1812? Regional self-interest led to a divided nation at war against the British. The Federalists actually opposed Madison's war because there was a fear that a war with Britain would hurt trade. And they talked of secession and proposed several constitutional amendments, but they never acted upon them. But their lack of support for the War of 1812 caused the Federalist Party to disappear. There would only be one remaining party, the Democratic Republican Party, the party of Jefferson, in the immediate aftermath of the War of 1812. But later, because of the corrupt bargain of 1824, in that election where Jackson won the popular vote but lost the majority in the Electoral College and lost the election to John Quincy Adams, there was a split in the Democratic-Republican Party between the National Republicans and the Jacksonian Democrats. The Jackson era and the Jacksonian Democrats will take office in 1828. Andrew Jackson represented the age of the common man, a heightened emphasis on equality in political processes for white males, a change in the style of campaigning to bring it closer to the people, increased voter participation, a renewed sense of a democratic spirit, and a challenge to aristocrats or elites. And they rewarded campaign supporters, even the common man, with office. This was called the spoils system. There was also a third party called the Know-Nothings that were largely in the North, in the cities, that represented interest group politics. The Know-Nothings largely were anti-immigrant. They feared that immigrants were coming to take American factory jobs. Pride in the victory during the War of 1812 and little party bickering in the immediate aftermath of the failure of the Federalist Party to sustain itself produced a so-called era of good feelings during the James Monroe years. James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, which really consolidated American policies for the next 100 years. The doctrine stated that American continent should not be considered for future colonization by any European power, that nations in the Western Hemisphere were inherently different from those in Europe, and that we were republics and not monarchies. The U.S. would regard as a threat to its own peace and safety any attempt by European powers to impose their system on any independent state in the Western Hemisphere. And finally, that the U.S. would not interfere in European affairs. We would largely focus on our own development. This policy will impact us for the next 100 years, and we'll be talking about it in relation to other things we cover in other units. American settlers poured west from the coastal states following the War of 1812 into the growing Midwest, Southwest, and even Texas. They were seeking economic opportunity in the form of land to farm. The belief that it was America's manifest destiny or God-given right to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans provided political support for territorial expansion. This is the famous picture of Lady Liberty leading the way of settlers, miners, as they push west. The American Indian, buffalo recede into the background to American progress west. You need to be familiar with that picture. During this period, however, of westward migration, the American Indians were repeatedly defeated in violent conflicts with settlers and soldiers who forcibly removed them from their ancestral homelands. They were either forced to march far away from their homes, such as in the case of the Trail of Tears, which relocated by military force several Atlantic coast tribes to Oklahoma, which was designated Indian Territory, or the natives would be confined to reservations. There were also during this period a lot of growing sectional tensions that were caused by competing economic interests. In the industrialized North, they favored high protective tariffs to protect northern manufactured goods from foreign competition. The growth of railroads and canals helped the growth of an industrial economy and the movement west. This etching showing these improvements in transportation, banking and business, and even manufacturing. In contrast, the South remained primarily agricultural, and they opposed high tariffs that made the price of imports more expensive. Sectional tensions were also caused by debates over the future of the Union itself. South Carolinians argued that sovereign states could nullify or cancel the Tariff of 1832 and other acts of Congress. The Union that allowed state governments to invalidate acts of national legislature could be dissolved by the states, seceding from the Union in defense of their life and their institution of slavery. This was the so-called nullification crisis of the 1800s, prior to the Civil War itself. President Andrew Jackson threatened to send federal troops to collect the tariff in South Carolina. He threatened war itself, but there was a compromise and war was averted. But the same issue of states' rights would come up again when we get to the 1860s and the Civil War. Sectional tensions were also caused by westward expansion itself. As new states entered the Union, compromises were reached to maintain the balance of power in Congress between free states and slave states. The Missouri Compromise was amongst the first. Missouri was the first state ready for statehood that would upset the balance of power between free states and slave states. This drew a line at the 3630 through the Louisiana Purchase territory only, with slavery prohibited above the line and allowed below, with the exception of Missouri itself, which was allowed to come in as a slave state, balanced by Maine, which came in as a free state. This would be the first of many compromises, and we'll talk about other issues regarding slave versus free as we get closer to the Civil War. Finally, that is the key political question, the balance of power in Congress between slave or free. The Deep South had revitalized slavery with Eli Whitney's Cotton Gin, while the North defended its free labor system as superior. This becomes a key issue as we go forward in the 1800s. So while the early national period is a period of growth and national consolidation and pride following the War of 1812, it's also continuing a period of sectional divisions that we're going to see materialize into the Civil War come the mid-1800s.